756th contact Monday the 28th of September 2020, 1.12h.
Greetings, Eduard. Dear friend, you are still working, and that is good, otherwise I would have had to call you.
Greetings too, dear friend. Welcome, Ptaah. Surprised, because I thought you wouldn't be back until next week, because you said you didn't know whether you'd be away for 2 or 3 weeks.
That was the case, yes, but it all happened more quickly than expected.
Yes, something like that happens sometimes, which is gratifying. Well, but you know that I should actually know what Christian asked about the photos where Semjase circled around various trees with her jet ship.
I was able to clear this up with my daughter, and I also learned some very interesting things that I didn't know about, also quite astonishing things about you and ascetic, which she now revealed to me some things about what had happened.
Yes, there were a lot of things, and that you don't know about them, that's obvious, because things are different with you than they are with us on Earth. I have already learned that from your father's faith. I have also learned that your system of work and behavior in this respect really works smoothly, whereas our earthly system always leads to disaster, be it through stupid talk, betrayal or carelessness, etc.
You speak of the fact that, contrary to earthly rules, we carry out our tasks and areas of activity strictly individually and are also responsible for them in every respect, and do not talk about them with other people.
Yes, if I may say something about it, to make it understandable to all the people who will later be able to read everything of our conversation, after I have retrieved it and written it down, because it is not a secret, or, do you want to say something about it? If you...
I think you can explain it better, because, well, your explanations are always like that. I think that you always bring up the important factors in the right way, so that the listeners understand them. And you can do that better than I can, in the sense of the understanding of the people on Earth.
That's a bit of a lift, Ptaah, but I understand what you mean, that I speak the language of the Earthlings and... well, I'm one of them and I speak in their way of communication, as I've learned to do, like you and everyone else when we have open conversations, which I have to call up and write down. And when we talk in private, then... yes, it is a little different. But there's nothing to discuss about that.
But it should be so, because when I listen to the nonsensical, empty, meaningless, incomprehensible and important speeches which I hear from certain people who have important and very important things to explain and do in order to protect the life, health and safety of people, but who are unable to do so because they are still incapable of logical thought, like underage children, and are therefore stupid as so-called adults, then a clear and comprehensive correction should be necessary.
Oh, I see. Your words are directed at those in power, or those who are incapable of their office, or am I wrong?
No, you are not mistaken, for it urges me to raise this subject today, too, namely the childish inability of the leaders of all earthly states to cultivate logical thought processes and to take and enforce the right measures to control, contain and bring to a halt the corona epidemic. In the same way, this childlike inability applies to all those earthly men of all peoples who are just as predisposed as the leaders of the state themselves, but in such a way that, as a result of their pathological inability to think and reason and thus through their stupidity, they are unable to perceive the facts and cannot grasp them. You wrote this as a prediction to the leaders of Switzerland in the 1940s as a 10-year-old boy, because even then you were already well educated in the written language, because my father and your teachers taught you exceptionally well for this. Even if they helped you to formulate and write your predictions and put your work into the right version, you must still be named as the author. Your letter was written in several languages, with the help of your two teachers, Graf and Lehman, Pastor Zimmerman and Professor Yun, so that everything was sent to governments, journals, newspapers, various organizations and radio stations all over the world, as I could see from my father's annals, and I was able to pick it all out because you asked me. But what has unfortunately emerged is that these handwritten records of my father are in disarray, so I may not be able to reproduce them logically, and therefore shifts may occur which you will have to correct yourself. I have also read in the notes that in your predictions some passages were omitted and not translated, not even in the German text, so everything that was sent was not complete, which you were not told. The omissions were passages referring to facts of American crimes, such as those in Vietnam, because these announcements would have been too dangerous at that time, namely for you, your parents and siblings. This was because it was feared that those responsible for all crimes would have done everything possible to silence you, and your parents and siblings would almost certainly have been involved in such action. The annals also contain remarks such as Gina Haspel in connection with a Central Intelligence Agency, but I have not yet found any details of this because, as I said, the records are somewhat disorganized. As for your prediction, as it was made by you at that time, it is still fully available, so I can send it to you in its original form. Although not everything will be correctly assembled during the process of assembling it, but the entire content is absolutely true to the original. You must be aware, however, that the passages which were removed at that time will still cause consternation among the military leaders and the state leaders in the USA today, because no written records were made of these facts, and President Johnson, as the initiator of the whole thing, ordered absolute silence, so that the present members of the administrations concerned etc. are completely ignorant of the inhuman machinations of that time. President Johnson conceived of the crimes with his advisors and the army leaders, because he was blinded by hatred, because in Vietnam the US combat units were unable to do anything, but were constantly suffering heavy losses. So he looked for ways and means to make things worse and worse, and finally put an end to it, also in a vengeful way, in order to exterminate the Vietnamese people.
I see. You mean that even today there can still be difficulties if I don't keep quiet about it?
Yes.
But I think it would be unfair, at least to the US population, if they continued to be left in the dark about what happened in Vietnam and elsewhere in the world, as well as about what happened in other criminal ways through US operations. I do not agree with this, not even if it means that some people are not only affected, but may also experience fear, anxiety, horror, confusion, horror and panic, trauma, horror and shock. Such things have to be processed and coped with, and it was the same with me, but it had to be done, even though I was only 10 years old at the time.
You
don't bother, my friend, because it's no use. But the Americans did eventually lose the Vietnam War. But what the US Army and US Air Force did in North Vietnam was absolutely in the spirit of President Johnson's hate-impregnated mind. Although the USA lost almost 60,000 US soldiers in the process, the Americans did not kill 2 to 5 million Vietnamese, contrary to American and other false assertions, but, according to your very precise observations and records, some 6.3 million Vietnamese. And even when, after Johnson, Nixon came to the US helm as the new US president, The U.S. war with Vietnam continued until 1975, with the victory of North Vietnam and the defeat of U.S. America. China and the Soviet Union supported the Vietnamese in this war and thus stood up to the superpower USA, which committed enormous war crimes and inhumanities of an unprecedented scale, for which neither the murderous military, the Air Force nor the U.S. government were ever accused or prosecuted. This is the same as elsewhere. Nixon, too, was an unworthy U.S. president, who one day fell into the same hatred as Johnson, but in a different way. His hatred was directed against the USA, because he had to break off his term of office and resign shamefully due to grave less than abuses of governmental authority greater than, which he could not bear and therefore initiated a crime of unprecedented vengeance with, which brings misfortune far and long after his death. At that time it was the so-called less than Watergate affair that broke the neck of the U.S. president, and this time it will be no different when the current U.S. president is deposed, because he too will misuse government powers in a similar way, trample the U.S. Constitution underfoot and throw the world into turmoil. But the difference will be that Trump will be voted out by most of the U.S. people, even though he himself and his stupid supporters will be terrorizing them. He and his stupid followers show, as I have been observing on television for some time, strong effective behaviors which make it clear that there is neither reason nor reason to think, understand and act. And this is the case with the seriously criminal Trump, who is protected from prosecution, court and punishment by his presidency, as well as with his stupid and idiotic followers and those who cheer him, which is why they seem to me like mindless clucking hens blindly running after their cock-a-doodle-doo. When I now talk about less than effective behavior greater than, then I must, whether I like it or not, take a stand on it and say that I actually have little objection to this term, because it is largely correct what Eugen Bleuler learned from Sfath, but in doing so he understood some things insufficiently, and consequently taught the incomplete for psychology and psychiatry to the earthlings in just this way, as Sfath explained to me when he taught me psychology for years. The whole of what Bleuler brought was therefore not complete, which I may well claim, because I learned a great deal more from your father Sfath than what he taught the Swiss schizophrenia researcher and psychoanalyst. The fact that affectivity is unfortunately still not fully understood today and is therefore not taught completely, is based on the fact that it corresponds less than only to short, impulsive emotions without cognitive processes, and therefore only to the totality of the emotional life, and less than mood greater than life, and therefore only to the affects, emotions, moods and drives. From my point of view, however, I can partly accept this interpretation and explanation of less than effective behavior greater than, because it does not fully correspond to the whole of the actual effective process. On the one hand, it erroneously defines the less than emotional life with the psychic state, because the less than greater than does not correspond to a certain state of the psyche, but to something completely different, which I will not go into further now, because it would lead too far. Like many other things, many things are misunderstood, especially predominantly in psychology, such as affectivity, which is wrongly, incorrectly or incompletely explained and just as wrongly judged, as well as the entire stupid construction and use of psychological tests. So this is also true of the false doctrine of affectivity, because it is limited only to the less than totality of the emotional and less than mood greater than life without cognitive processes. This is despite the fact that, in addition to the world of thought, it is also confronted with the consequential factors of feelings in the psyche, without which there is no action at all. So if no thoughts occur, then no feelings and no movements of the psyche can arise, but also no effective movements of any kind, neither negative nor positive, can arise. Every affectivity, whether negative or positive, requires preliminary thoughts, from which first of all the necessary emotions are formed, from which the necessary feelings are created, which then also produce their own corresponding emotions, which, continuing to develop, influence the psyche and orient it according to the positive or negative way of the previous thoughts and feelings. This means that every affectivity, however negative or positive, is dependent on either conscious or unconscious corresponding thoughts, feelings in the state of the psyche. However, this does not happen directly before an affectivity becomes acute, but long before, which means that the corresponding thoughts and feelings, as well as the state of mind that has been demolished by them, appear much earlier, but have then been deposited and thus remain. And this deposition takes place in the character permanent memory, remains lifelong and triggers at every suitable or unsuitable occasion effective actions. Therefore these are indirectly based on conscious or unconscious thoughts, feelings and on a state of mind that arose much earlier. The hours, days, weeks, months, years, decades are already half a life or more in the past, and then, because the whole thing was not processed and not dissolved, was stored in the character permanent memory as a lifelong trigger for the act of affection, in order to then evoke affectivities at every opportunity, or, as the case may be, to create a sense of the other, in order to explode at every suitable or unsuitable moment. Thinking or thoughts do not in any way mean that they have to be controlled in the sense of cognition, and therefore neither do they have to be controlled by understanding and reason, nor that thoughts as a whole have to be processed and dealt with rationally and logically. This means that consequently no conscious behavior-controlled and executive reorganization of information has to take place. Basically, thoughts, feelings in this state of mind can be conscious or unconscious, but never subconscious, and consciousness and subconsciousness are different factors, which is apparently unknown to earthly psychology, which means that when a conscious activity takes place, it is inevitably preceded by conscious thoughts and corresponding emotions. If, however, an affectivity occurs which, as an active affect, quickly, abruptly and, so to speak, lightning-like uncontrollably causes an activity, then this is inevitably preceded by unconscious thoughts and likewise unconscious feelings and a corresponding state of the psyche. In this way alone an affectivity is created, which means that without a conscious perception or recognition of preceding impulses of thoughts, feelings in the psyche, an extraordinary and explosive reactive action or short-circuit action takes place, the occurrence and course of which cannot be controlled by the person carrying out the action. This inability to control, or the inability to control the outbursts of emotion, which are usually caused by fear, anger, rage or fury, jealousy, disappointment, insanity, vindictiveness, a desire for revenge, are stored unconsciously, something completely unknown to earthly psychology, emotionally effectively in the character permanent memory, that is lifelong, and are always uncontrollably ready to break out at every possible or impossible opportunity, if not addressed and no efforts are made to dissolve them. If there is no conscious dissolution of the affectivity, outbursts of affection or acts of affection inevitably occur frequently, especially in irritable persons who do not make any effort to be free of personal aggression. In many cases, it is such people for whom aggression is the evil dominating element, whereby murder, manslaughter and violence are committed, revenge is taken and retribution is demanded. Other affects also occur in the form of panic attacks, as in partnership conflicts, suicidal behavior, spontaneous character changes, flight reactions, jealousy, hatred, enmity, sexual acts, pathos, illness, suffering, expectations, hopes, imaginations, emotions, suspicions, etc. The earthly psychological claim that an affectivity is the result of a violent excitement in emotion or a state of extraordinary psychological tension is nonsensical, because an affect does not correspond in any way to a temporary excitement or emotion caused by external causes or internal psychological processes, but to the whole of the affectivity, an affect or a state of extraordinary psychological tension. An active affect is not and never founded in less than only short, impulsive emotions without cognitive processes in the totality of the emotional life, and less than mood greater than life as well as the affects, emotions, moods and instincts arising from it, but the whole is solely the result of conscious or unconscious thoughts, feelings and psychic states, which have been deposited in the character permanent memory at earlier times, and which explode out of it in an affecting way. Such acts of affect do not, and this must also be said, correspond to any moral moods, behavior or bad moods etc., which usually last for hours, days, weeks or months or even years, and can even become a habit. Effectively, affectivities, outbursts of affect or acts of affect usually correspond to short-lived, traditional thought emotional psychological outbursts, which at some point in the past have caused a deliberately violent excitement, a boiling up and flare-up in which, as a result of their uncontrolled violence and the indifference of the person, have stored themselves in his character permanent memory, and again effectively erupt.
You never cease to amaze me with your knowledge in a variety of matters and areas, be it in any one of them, whereby I am not only thinking of your knowledge, but also of your craftsmanship.
Please, this is perfectly normal and nothing unusual. Your father's faith and my life have been good teachers to me, Ptaah, but I think that what I know and can do, because I had the chance to learn it, is certainly not special knowledge and skills, so the whole thing need not be mentioned specifically. In the end, every person can acquire it if he is willing to learn and consciously works through his life and everything he experiences and learns as knowledge. And if a person really does this and goes through it, then he knows, understands and is able to do a lot with his hands. Such people know and are able to do something more than just those who do not make the effort, which is no reason to consider them special. We earthlings call such people simply all-rounders, and these are the ones who, despite their slightly more knowledge and skills, continue to learn throughout their lives.
It's just impossible to. It's probably worthless.
What?
It's all right. We talked about the predictions, to which I must add that the one I found was not the one you wanted and that you had written in the sanatorium. But if you want this prediction, which you also wrote in 1947 and which I found in my father's estate, then I can now retrieve it for you and name it if you like. Billy, yes, of course, because the prediction we were talking about is not to be found here and has disappeared somewhere. But Nadette has only found something of it, and that is the following, which she beamed onto my computer. The 7th of September 1947, letter from Eduard to the Federal Council, excerpt. Anything of this nature corresponds to a crime which is tolerated by the Swiss state, and which nevertheless calls our country neutral, peaceful Switzerland. But where is the highly praised neutrality and freedom, when war and murder material is sold all over the world for the sake of money, thereby murdering masses of people and causing enormous destruction? The whole thing corresponds to nothing other than an unscrupulousness of an unprecedented scale, which was practiced by Bull before the beginning of and during the Second World War out of selfish greed for money, and which continues to be practiced, just as other Swiss war material manufacturers did and continue to do with the knowledge of the government. They supplied war material to the Nazi regime and at the same time to the equally criminal America, which wants to subjugate all states to world domination and will therefore from now on do everything in its power to promote strife, rebellion, war and destruction all over the world, and to become the largest nuclear power, which will continue in the new millennium. In the process, when America has already made itself indispensable in many countries around the world, Russia and China will be increasingly challenged by America, and Switzerland will also be criminally complicit in this, because it too, like America in the front line and first and foremost, will be doing arms deals with criminal states. All in all, it will be murder deals which will bring death and misery, destruction and annihilation tens of millions of times over the world, and Switzerland, with its arms exports, will also bear a great deal of the blame for this. All the wars and terrorist attacks that continue to take place in many countries around the world, like all other major murders, rampant misery, famines and even future epidemics, will cost hundreds of thousands and even millions of lives and trigger waves of refugees. Eduard Mir, Low Flax 1253, Bulak/ZH. You wrote this as an introduction to your prediction to the Federal Council of Switzerland, together with a prediction intended for worldwide distribution, as my father noted in his notes, although I have not yet been able to find this prediction. Your other predictions, which I have now found, do not correspond to what you have written to the Federal Council as an introduction. As for this other broad prediction, which is dated Sunday the 16th of May 1947 and is quite extensive in terms of subject matter, it corresponds not only to more than one prediction, but to something I have never encountered before in my life. And please, do not interrupt me, because what I have to say corresponds to thoughts that move me and that I must speak out. You were a boy of only 10 years old at the time when you wrote everything, even if you were assisted by several adults and much older people than you were when you were adept at formulating and writing. My father may have mentioned that he no longer judged you as a boy, but as an adult who thought further, understood more and judged more logically than many adults. But it is nevertheless much more than amazing to me what you achieved at your young age at that time. Even with us, who have been brought up by our parents from an early age in a way and manner, and who are taught and instructed in all the necessities of life, nothing similar has ever come to my knowledge during my long life. Moreover, everything you have collected corresponds to much more than a simple prediction. Furthermore, it also contains some indications of certain contemporary coming events, which are mentioned with year dates for the next decades to the end of millennia. Eduard, dear friend, everything is really quite astonishing to me, and if I did not know better that everything actually corresponds to what and how it was written down by my father's fath, I would doubt the whole thing. That, dear friend, had to be said, because I don't know what else to say.
Thank you, Ptaah, dear friend. I don't know what to say about this either, so let's just leave what has been said and not talk about it anymore.
That will be right. Now, as for the predictions, my father's notes indicate that you would be accused of lying, slander and conspiracy theories, especially.
I think I know what you want to say, as well as that you have found those predictions based on the direct observations etc. of the past and future journeys with your father's fath. Maybe I could find some descriptions or something in Wikipedia, which I could then add to the predictions at the appropriate places, or what do you think?
My father's records correspond to your assumption. And if you can find information on Wikipedia, then it can very well be inserted at the appropriate places in the predictions.
Eben, I thought so too. As far as conspiracy theories are concerned, however, I should actually say something more about this. Since time immemorial, terrestrial mankind has been misled by confused conspiracy theories, one of the earliest of which is demonstrably widespread as early as the 12th century, by which it was maliciously claimed, lying and out of Christian-influenced religious hatred, that in 1144 Jews kidnapped a child from a Christian family and sacrificed it by ritual murder in a secret ritual on the Feast of Passover. This nonsense was attributed to the ancient hatred of Jews in the Christian world, which had started from the very beginning of Christianity, when Jews were said to be the culprits in the crucifixion and death of less than Jesus greater than, who never bore this name but was called Immanuel. And this idiotic and unjustified hatred of the Jews has since then survived uninhibitedly for more than 2 millennia through ever new theories of lies, malicious slander and completely feeble-minded conspiracy theories, has been pushed further and further and has not found an end until today. Constantly renewing and increasing, it has been preserved by Christianity and Islam and shaped to the millennia-old persecution of the Jews. This resulted in an uninterrupted arming and often led to the murder of Jewish believers. This went on for all times, until the madness of the mass extermination of Jews by the Hitler regime in the last World War. And it is still only 2 years since this crime against humanity was officially ended, but not eradicated, because the mania for hating Jews continues to blaze in Nietzsche-obsessed people who are spreading all over the world and who will continue to stir up hatred of Jews into the distant future of the third millennium, bringing disaster, murder and destruction and much suffering, misery and need into the world. And this is what has happened by a terrorist organization which was set up in the Orient by a mad sectarian. So death, disaster and destruction and hatred of Jews together with hatred of Christians has continued to spread throughout the world. Conspiracy theories of many kinds will continue and will continue to create lies and slander, hatred, falsehood and fiends around the world, causing harm and murder. And this will continue to be the case as it has been since time immemorial with regard to the hatred of Jews by Christianity, Islam and the Nazis, and will continue to be the case in the future by Nietzsche-possessed and fanatical terrorists of the wrongly handed down and misunderstood teachings of the proclaimers Muhammad and Immanuel alias less than Jesus greater than. But conspiracy theories based on nonsense, as morbidly stupid as Jew hatred is, are equally true for such nonsense directed against other organizations etc., such as the Illuminati Order, the Freemasons, Rosicrucians and Templars etc., whereby everything in any of these secret societies is demonized and demonized to the letter. One or the other of the conjectures may be true here and there, but on the whole, all conspiracy theories are nothing more than stupid and illogical nonsense. It is precisely such conspiracy theories which unfairly lead to the incontestable facts being invented and disseminated maliciously, out of hatred, for the purpose of covering up or falsifying them, as well as for the purpose of denying the truth, secret or underhanded purposes, etc., thereby denying, falsifying and denying realities, and by deliberately false conspiracy theories. And this was also the case with the predictions that were made in the 1960s, for which America is responsible and vehemently denies the facts and denies them as conspiracy theories. That is all that remains to be said.
Then I will now play back the recordings. To the rulers, authorities and all other persons in charge of armies, organizations, as well as to all chiefs, leaders, the Pope, all preachers and pastors of all religions and sects, and all people of the earth. I am still a boy of 10 years, but I have knowledge of the coming times, which will bring bad and malignant changes on the humanity of the earth, which I predict, write down and spread in the world. This after clearly identified events that will take place in the future, because people are not changing for the better and are becoming more and more degenerate, more and more indifferent and strangers to each other, greedy for money and sectarian. It must be said in advance that I am not yet fully educated in language and writing, and so I need the help of my 5 adult and highly educated friends to formulate and write all that I have to say and predict according to my own sense of purpose. It is also thanks to their help that my predictions have been translated and reproduced in English, Italian and French, as they can now be sent to all countries thanks to their financial efforts. This to all the fathers and leaders of all countries on earth, to all the editorial offices of well-known important daily newspapers of all countries, to important economic, religious and private organizations, to army leaders, reporters, the Pope, well-known journalists, as well as to correspondents, reporters, authorities, radio and television stations. Eduard Mir, Nidaflax 1253, Bulac, the 6th of June 1947. Everything that will happen on Earth in the future, starting from today, corresponds to a crime committed by an enormously increasing humanity on Earth, promoted and tolerated by all governments in a totally irresponsible manner, and promoted by the peoples themselves in an erroneous, selfish, unreasoning, stupid and irrational way. The root cause of this will be a vast mass of overpopulation flooding the whole Earth, whose innumerable needs will cause an unstoppable disaster and spread planet-wide. Today I coined the term less than overpopulation greater than, and it will be carried far into the future and will become a catchword for all those who are still rational and sensible. The whole of the humanity of the Earth, which will overflow very quickly in the future, will henceforth, as never before, with the participation of all completely irresponsible governments of all countries of the Earth, promote large-scale and extensive destruction on and in planet Earth. Destruction and extermination will also take place in the future throughout the world of millions of all life forms. Consequently, many genera and species in nature, its fauna and flora, or in the entire flora, fauna and other life forms of the air, forests, meadows, floodplains, meadows and marshes, fields, gardens and swamps, as well as all mountains, springs, streams, lakes, rivers and seas, the Arctic and Antarctic, deserts and primeval forests etc. will be destroyed, annihilated or wiped out. And this will affect more than 1,400 species during the period from now until the beginning of the third millennium alone, with various genera and their species being completely exterminated. But also in the new millennium this kind of destruction, extermination will continue and will sadly continue in a few decades with more than 200 further extinctions. The complete extinction of a wide range of bird, mammal, other animal species, vital insects, bees, butterflies, wasps, fish and many other life forms will mean that pollination or fertilization of important food crops will no longer be possible, so that they will remain fruitless, die over time and be extinct. While efforts will be made to artificially pollinate and directly by human beings, this will not solve the problem of fertilization of essential food crops in the long term. The most fundamental problem for the Earth's population, which is growing in excess, is the problem of food supply itself, which means that more and more food crops will have to be cultivated. The growth of mankind is also creating more and more necessary and unnecessary needs, which increase with every new human being born. And these needs, which have existed today and since time immemorial, must be fulfilled by hook or by crook, not only today, but even more so in the future, because the coming humanity, which will overpopulate the Earth from now on, will set no limits for itself in all its greedy needs. And this will have a degenerating effect on the entire living conditions, and thus also on the food supply of the overpopulation, which is becoming more and more powerful. This is in addition to the fact that in just a few decades all natural foods will no longer suffice, but chemical foods will have to be produced which will fill the stomach and satisfy hunger, but which will bring disease and suffering. Natural food production can only be achieved by plundering and looting all land, meadows, fields, acres, floodplains, swamps, marshes and all waters such as streams, rivers, lakes, ponds and seas, and even the mountains and the planet itself, slowly destroying and annihilating them. This is done by, moreover, contaminating everything as a whole with chemical poisons that are harmful to health all round, poisoning not only food plants, people and all nature and its life forms, as well as groundwater and all waters, but also the atmosphere. And as a result, countless people will suffer from serious ailments and diseases which will often spread through the body like epidemics, such as serious incurable cancers which will become a widespread disease in the future. In addition to the endless increase in the demand for food, more and more consumer goods of all kinds will have to be produced in the future in order to satisfy the greed of the emerging excess mass of mankind and to develop the industry and economy which will inevitably be created for this purpose and which alone will guarantee everything in the future. In the future it will be inevitable that with the enormous growth of humanity, the planet, all natural systems, the fauna and flora, and also the climate will be largely destroyed, possibly to the point of imminent collapse, which will at least lead to complete fruitlessness or the destruction of large areas of land. The Earth will soon be so overpopulated that in future large areas of the Earth will become completely barren through overexploitation for food and will lead to the irresponsible clearing and complete destruction of huge areas of forests and primeval forests, which basically absorb toxic heat emissions, thereby protecting the climate from warming and also regulating the moisture content of the atmosphere and thus also rainfall, etc. The cleared forests and primeval forests, however, whose fertile soil is only 20-30 centimeters at the surface and is then planted by farmers, etc., leaches out after about 2 years and becomes useless, unproductive wasteland. It dries up and dies away, causing everything to wilt, die, wither, yellow, wither away and become completely desolate. And this then leads to new clear-cutting of the forests and primeval forests, over and over again, which inexorably affects and warms the climate more and more. Everything that will be cultivated, harvested, processed and marketed in the future will soon no longer be able to be done by hard manual labor, but only by machine and equipment due to the ever-increasing and rapidly growing mass of humanity. And this will soon only be possible by means of further advanced electronic techniques, based on new inventions which are still unthinkable today and which will automate all working and processing procedures. For the time being, however, and this will be maintained well into the third millennium, much of this still relates to all kinds of motorized working machines of all kinds, which will be used to carry out work for decades to come and into the new millennium in a wide variety of fields. This begins with horticulture, street cleaning, the entire agriculture, road construction, building construction, mining, oil production, coal mining, etc., etc. All of these countless explosion engines, running all over the world, some of them day and night, and powered by fuels derived from petroleum, produce enormous tonnages of exhaust gases which give off thermal radiation. On the one hand, these are harmful to the health of people and also to the natural world. They are a burden to it and cause many to fall ill. However, the climate is particularly badly affected, which is very serious because of the strong unnatural global warming and the resulting global change, which causes enormous natural disasters. It will be impossible to avoid primeval storms and devastating violent storms, floods, landslides, debris flows, and huge forest fires or house fires caused by lightning, etc. throughout the world. All of this will not only cause immense financial damage and destruction of human achievements, but also the complete destruction of many kinds of values, as well as much misery, distress and grief when many people die. For example, hundreds of thousands of people will fall victim to natural disasters by the beginning of the third millennium due to climate change, which is already taking effect. To this end, only a few of those who will surrender this century should be mentioned in advance, such as one in Mexico, which will claim more than 1,900 lives in the coming decade, in 1959, as a result of a hurricane. 11 years later, in 1970, 342,000 people will lose their lives in East Pakistan to a cyclone, and just 2 years later in Persia some 5,900 people will die in a huge and unusual snowstorm. China, too, will have to bear much suffering and grief when a typhoon claims some 167,000 lives in 1975. Then 5 years later, in 1980, a heat wave of over 42 degrees Celsius will kill over 2,400 people in the United States of America. There have always been natural disasters. But what will happen in the future as a result of the irresponsible manipulation of the Earth's treasures by mankind, which will destroy everything, will surpass anything that has ever happened before. The destruction and annihilation of huge parts of the whole of nature and its fauna and flora, as well as of the rainforests, meadows, fields, meadows, etc., and of the waters, such as the saltwater Aral Sea in Central Asia, which is responsible for the climate of Europe and covers some 70,000 square kilometers, will have serious consequences. In a few decades, up to the beginning of the third millennium, the Aral Sea will be subject to prolonged drying up due to the draining of water, as a result of which all fish stocks, such as eel, carp, bream, zander, pipe perch, merengue, Bilatamia barbels, and southern nine-spine stickleback, etc., along with other life forms existing on, around and in the lake, will also become extinct. The whole of the henceforth arising and evil climate change, which in future will cause enormous natural catastrophes worldwide, is based as a conclusion of the origin only in the whole world exuberant mass of mankind, through which everything on and in the planet, as well as in all natural systems, will be destroyed by the destructive, annihilating and exterminating manipulations. It is only through the ever-growing human race that global warming is taking place, not only through the above-mentioned heat emissions, but first and foremost through humanity's obsession to satisfy innumerable needs of all kinds. In order to satisfy their needs, everything is directed against the continued existence of the natural order, thereby demolishing and eradicating everything through criminal manipulation of the planet, the entire nature, and all living things of the fauna and flora, so that the once flourishing life on the entire planet is slowly coming to a standstill, just as the climate is warming up through the fault of mankind, so that in the future some natural catastrophes will rage daily somewhere on Earth and cause mischief. In this respect, in the coming times of the future, everything will be surpassed that has ever been destroyed, annihilated and wiped out on Earth since the appearance of man by man himself. As far as the toxic heat emissions of all working machines are concerned, they are further increased by the use of all kinds of motorized public transport, private and business vehicles, aircraft, ships, working machines, heating systems, fireworks, refuse, waste, pits, forests, virgin forests, coal seams, peat fields, dry areas, and other fires of all kinds, lightning, arson or fire clearance. All of these factors have a destructive effect on the climate, as well as the irresponsible deforestation and burning of the rainforests, which are the actual lungs of the Earth and determine the climate of the entire planet. This is due to the demands of the exuberant humanity, which wants to have its needs met, but this will only be possible if the planet Earth, all natural systems and nature itself with its fauna and flora and the climate are harassed, destroyed and devastated. In future, however, this will not only be achieved by the millions of machines and vehicles etc. which are powered by explosion engines, because in order to feed the huge mass of the endlessly growing mass of the Earth's population, millions of tons of pathogenic chemical poisons will be thoughtlessly introduced into food crops in the future. And these poisons will also do a great deal to cause damage to nature and its fauna and flora, which will lead to the destruction and extinction of many genera and species of fauna and flora. And this will increase steadily in proportion to the inexorably increasing mass of humanity. This, as well as all the ever-increasing overpopulation, whose desire for luxury, for travel, pleasure, vice, addiction and other countless things of wanting to have, but especially for the necessary food, will increase. This, however, will be the real reason for global warming and the enormous natural catastrophes and all the destruction that may result. This, together with the main cause of all the destruction, devastation and extermination that will be caused by the criminal destructive manipulations of the overflowing humanity, is the real reason for all the evils, disasters and degenerations of the future. The conclusion of the origin of the future rapidly increasing climate change and all the very bad natural catastrophes that will undoubtedly come inevitably and cause enormous destruction, devastation and mischief that will also claim many human lives, is therefore not simply based on the heat emissions that destroy nature and the climate, but fundamentally on the oversized mass of mankind on Earth and its all-destroying manipulations of planet Earth, all its natural systems and the fauna and flora. So it is the oversized mass of terrestrial humanity that needs to be tackled by rapidly and radically reducing it, which can only be done through a perennial and worldwide and controlled birth stop and, thereafter, through hard controlled birth control. Planet Earth is ideally designed for a human population of around 529 million, but in excess it cannot support more than 2.5 billion people, and terrestrial humanity should be prepared for this in order to live in harmony and peace not only for itself but also in symbiosis with planet Earth, with all its natural systems, all the natural creatures of the fauna and flora. This, without carrying out any destructive, annihilating or eradicating influences. It must be repeated once again that by cutting down trees in forests and rainforests, as well as by eradicating other plants, they can no longer absorb heat emissions. Consequently, these toxic and climate-damaging gases will accumulate in the atmosphere and spread worldwide, which will not only warm up and damage the climate, but will also inevitably lead to natural disasters. Monstrous and all-destroying violent storms, primeval rain, hail and snowstorms, sandstorms, as well as the melting of glaciers and of the South and North Pole and of the permafrost will already begin today. But in the future everything will increase and intensify very fast and getting worse and worse, through the witnessing and giving birth of countless new descendants, whereby the excess of humanity will drive up all evil that will from now on attack and dominate the earth and humanity. And this is also due to the machinations of the overflowing humanity as a result of its needs, which must be met by exploiting the planet and nature, its fauna and flora and all its systems, while also destroying the climate and, through all its activities, endlessly everything. In particular, heat emissions will be an important factor, but they will be produced by human beings, pushing the climate to the brink of collapse. And this will inevitably be the case in the future for terrestrial mankind, because it is losing out as a result of the overbreeding of logical thinking, and consequently it will fall into stupidity and possibly bring about its own death. From now on, people will become more and more indifferent to themselves and to others, to nature, its fauna and flora, to all natural systems, and to everything and anything. Conflict and obscenity will spread more and more in the future, in families as well as in the streets, in schools and everywhere else. In particular, there will be more and more murders in families, as well as in a political way, but especially as a result of religious hatred by refugees who have immigrated or smuggled into Europe and who belong to or sympathize with an Arabic, but worldwide spread criminal, murderous and fanatical terrorist organization. The resulting terrorism, which is spreading, and which carries out terrorist attacks on places of worship, believers and unsuspecting passers-by, as well as on security forces and officials, etc., will spread great evil and create much misery and suffering through increased assassination and murder. This will particularly affect the Union countries of the newly emerging dictatorship in Europe. But once again, back to planet Earth, which will be undermined, just as all systems of natural habitats will be largely robbed, irrevocably destroyed and devastated, just as many forms of life of all kinds and species of fauna and flora will be completely wiped out and masses of people will be killed off by suffering, disease and epidemics. All habitats are being destroyed by the endlessly increasing needs and the resulting or destroying machinations of the rampantly growing humanity on Earth, and also cause a climate catastrophe. The future will bring a worldwide atmospheric pollution and poisoning of the atmosphere by poisonous substances of all kinds, such as vehicle exhaust fumes, huge forest and landscape fires, by heat emissions of all kinds, etc., as well as global warming and climate destruction, as well as a climate shift on all continents, combined with the melting of the poles and all glaciers and permafrost, which will release dangerous earth methane gases everywhere, as well as on the sea floor, because the temperatures of the oceans are rising just as much as those of the climate. Everything will be tolerated worldwide by all governments and by all peoples, as well as the fact that in Europe a union dictatorship will come into being, to which many countries of Europe will fall under and gradually be swayed by this dictatorship, and that lying and treacherous governments and parties falling under the spell of stupidity or their members will try to betray neutral Switzerland, their own homeland, to this dictatorship. Against this enormously treacherous request, which will incomprehensibly not be punished by law, only a People's Party, which was founded in 1971, will openly resist, while other parties will hide away completely or halfway cowardly. The fact will remain, however, that Switzerland, with its highly praised neutrality and freedom, is to be forced and bartered into this emerging union dictatorship by traitorous elements as a result of sheer stupidity and greed for money. Switzerland will unfortunately become guilty of war and murder in foreign countries as a result of economic breakup and disregard for neutrality, by selling war and murder material, weapons, guns and special small aircraft all over the world through the arms industry, leading to uprisings, civil wars, terror and wars, thereby murdering masses of people and causing enormous destruction. The whole thing corresponds to nothing more than an unparalleled unscrupulousness driven by greed, which even before the beginning and during the two last world wars was and will continue to be operated by various companies and corporations in Switzerland out of selfish greed for money. This, as well as war material manufacturers in the United States of America did and will continue to do with the knowledge of the government, whereby Germany and Switzerland in particular will also excel in this respect in the future. Switzerland already supplied war material to the NEOC regime and at the same time to the equally criminal Americans, who have always sought to subjugate many states in a world domination addiction, and will therefore continue to do everything possible to promote strife, rebellion, war, terror and destruction all over the world, in order to invade and bind foreign states to themselves, under the guise of providing aid. Also, from the beginning of the third millennium, Switzerland's neutrality will be disregarded and broken elsewhere by a so-called popular decree, which will only be a short one, namely by carrying out armed military less-than-peace operations in foreign countries under the cloak of less-than-peace missions greater than, with small arms and long firearms as well as with machine guns, to which also tanks as well as helicopters etc. will be added, under concealing details of the circumstances that will actually occur. These armed less-than-peace missions will greater than, or Swiss Army members are to defend themselves with no weapons, if it proves necessary, and thus do nothing else but kill people in foreign countries in the name of Swiss neutrality. After the Americans' criminal atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States of America is striving to become the world's largest nuclear power, but soon, through treachery, Russia, China and other states will also have deadly, destructive and/or destroying nuclear weapons and power plants, as well as nuclear power plants that contaminate large areas. Until well into the third millennium, a dangerous nuclear threat will continue to dominate the world, spreading fear and creating the threat of nuclear war several times during a less-than-cold peace period greater than, but this can happily be prevented for the next 75 years by less-than incidences greater than. America, as always, will try to become the ruler of the world through military intervention in foreign countries, which will continue unabated in the new millennium. In the new millennium, however, China will also strive to expand and seize power on a global scale. Huge tracts of land will be bought up by China around the world in the coming decades to grow food for its 2 billion people, as it seeks to return to Hong Kong and Taiwan in the new millennium. At the same time, however, even the powerful Americans and their military will not rest easy in continuing to create a great deal of misery on the globe, because they will continue to make themselves indispensable all over the world by military interventions in many countries with evil weapons. In the second decade of the new millennium, the United States of America will enter an era of chaotic rule by a mad and unscrupulous president who will take power through unfair vote buying, as well as through secret threats, lies, slander and false promises, and will use the years of his presidency to turn large sections of the governments and peoples of many countries around the world against himself and the United States of America as a result of his stupidity. He will also end up making himself unpopular in his own party, as well as wreaking havoc within his own country and dividing the American people in their senses and aspirations. From the second decade of the third millennium onwards, Russia and China will be dangerously and stupidly challenged and humiliated by this mad, notorious liar, slanderer and self-assertionist, megalomaniac President of the United States of America. Through the actions and behavior of this lingless, incompetent and often self-contradictory and ridiculous President, increasing hatred will arise against him worldwide, but the people of the United States of America will also be exposed to ridicule. This is because they will not defend themselves against the state terror by this criminal president, who will also be responsible, in several breaches of the Constitution, for the fact that an epidemic which is spreading throughout the world will claim hundreds of thousands of lives in America. This is because he will trivialize and ridicule the life-threatening epidemic, and consequently no protective measures will be taken and no measures ordered to contain the epidemic. This criminal US president will quickly and unrestrainedly distinguish himself by self-importance and ever-increasing breaches of the Constitution, and by a secret and undercover, extreme rule tolerated by his party, and will also be supported by a confused, stupid and glorifying part of the people, whereas the lawmakers, his party and all his followers among the people, however, remain silent and allow him to continue unrestrainedly throughout all the years of his sinister work. Through this madman, discord will arise against America all over the world, just as he will act as a terrorist in his own country, creating discord as well as dangers of sedition and war in other countries. So nothing will be done against this madman, but to the contrary he will be unjustly promoted by his party comrades in order to justify his criminal violations of the Constitution and to be able to retain political power through all his actions. Switzerland, too, will criminally help to promote unrest, strife and war in many countries, because it, too, like mainly in the front line and first and foremost America, will engage in arms deals with criminal states, thereby creating unrest, murder, lack of freedom and terror in many countries. All in all, it will be profit-greedy murder deals which will bring death and misery, destruction and annihilation tens of millions of times over to the whole world, and Switzerland, with its arms exports, will therefore also bear a great deal of the blame. Above all, however, America will remain the world leader in this respect well into the third millennium. In the future there will be more and more frequent riots and demonstrations etc. in many countries around the world, as well as many wars in which America in particular will unjustifiably and violently intervene militarily and murder many hundreds of thousands and even millions of people. Acting like a world power and world police force, the American military, especially in Asia, will spread death, misery, need, murder and mass murder, out of cowardly fear, hatred, world domination, and one way or another basically out of religious delusion. Wherever they invade foreign countries, they will, as they have always done, carry out executions on natives, crimes against women, men, young people, children and infants, and spread endless sorrow and terror. Shallbe it will happen again in 3 years' time, in other words in the next decade, from 1950 to 1953, when a war will be waged in Korea between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea, during which the Allied People's Republic of China on the one hand and United Nations troops on the other, led, of course, by the Americans in the front line, will fight out the war. Shortly after the Korean War, namely from 1955, the American military will be waging an unprecedented murderous and massacring war in Vietnam until the mid-1972, not only raping countless women and murdering them according to less than usage greater than as well as men, youths, children and infants, not only shooting them, but also cutting off the heads of many, especially children and infants, with machetes and the like, or literally slaughtering them with their machetes etc. But all this, and the knowledge about it, will never be made public, but will be kept such strict secrecy and punished, not only up to life imprisonment, but up to the death penalty, because making these massacres public will be punished under American law as treason and endangering the state's security. Now, as for these American military degenerations coming to Vietnam, they will take place during a war that will continue to rage for many years between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The United States of America, China and the Soviet Union will of course be involved in this war. In this war, too, America will be committing huge crimes against the civilian population in Vietnam, as it has done in the past, as it did with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. This is being done by the personal initiative of senior military officers and key government officials to use B-29 bombers, the kind used during the last World War to carry a machine in the less than Langenzinc and greater than behind the Horigenwald forest in Bulak/Hori. Many villages and towns and their inhabitants were bombarded with practically unquenchable oil-based gelatinous fuel, so-called napalm, as was done for the first time in the last World War, when the Americans dropped napalm bombs over Japanese towns, burning countless people alive, as will be done later in Vietnam as well by the completely dehumanized American military. And this will come about in the mid-1960s, when American B-29 bomb squadrons will drop around 32,816,000 hectoliters or hundreds of thousands of tons of napalm within a period of 5 months, according to foreign calculations by neutral observers not involved in the war, and turn villages and towns into a sea of flames and people into burning torches. A further crime in this war in Vietnam is caused by religious fanatical sectarians in government circles, who, as a result of religious and racial hatred against people of different faiths and ethnicities in Vietnam, are ordering the American military, which is degenerating into a human race, to spray chemical poisons from airplanes and helicopters with far-reaching multiple effects. On the one hand, this is done in such a devious way to make the Vietnamese people suffer from various long-term illnesses, but on the other hand it is also done to restrict the birth rate of the Vietnamese. These chemical toxins will cause the fetus to atrophy in the womb, or severe brain or body deformations to develop, resulting in severe birth defects and tens of thousands of new births. In addition, these chemical toxins will be extremely long-lasting and will retain their dangerous, destructive and disease-causing effects for a long time. Accordingly, many hundreds of thousands and even several million people will fall ill with fatal cancer and other ailments and die when they come into contact with the toxins, whether through touch, drinking water, eating or through the toxins deposited in the soil, which are absorbed by all growing plants when they are planted and poisoned and when people eat. The fact and truth of what has been revealed, which was foreseen by neutral observation, will be treated as a top secret of the American government and will be kept secret from the military in America and Vietnam, but betrayal would be punished with the harshest possible punishment. As a result, all those involved in this crime will remain silent for the rest of their lives, as will the producers of these toxic substances, such as, among others, those responsible for the American companies Dow Chemical and Mabe of the Monsanto chain. As has been explained, in Vietnam the American military or their Air Force will use chemical defoliants to completely defoliate and destroy the forests in order to make it more difficult for the enemy guerrilla movement, the Viet Cong, to camouflage themselves through the dense jungle and destroy their food supply, as well as poisoning the food fields and their crops. As a result, the farmers will no longer be able to bring in harvests, and many of the population will suffer hunger and starvation. But this will not be enough for the brutally degenerated and scrupulous and contemptuous American military, who will also burn down houses, huts, housing estates and entire villages, and mercilessly shoot many of the inhabitants if they want to complain or defend themselves. What America has achieved and thus created disaster, other countries around the world will in future allow themselves to do the same and other things in the same way, as the Soviet Union will carry out the first atomic bomb test in Kazakhstan in about 27 months from today's date in 1949. In 1961, the Soviet Union will once again make a name for itself, when a Soviet military pilot will be officially the first man on Earth to be launched into orbit by a rocket, orbiting the planet in a circular orbit and then returning safely to Earth. In 1965, the Persian Emperor Reza Pahlavi is assassinated in Persia, but he survives the attack. From 1961 onwards, the Soviet orbit of the Earth means that this event is received extremely unpleasantly by America, which is why more and more intensive work will be done on a space project which has been running for some time. In particular, former Nazi engineers who were responsible for rocket construction in the Nazi Empire during the World War will work on it. These people have already been put in charge by America to build rockets to fly to the moon, which will actually succeed. By pushing this technique, after the Soviet Union's rocket orbit of the Earth, no second success should be granted, so everything will be done to outdo the Soviet Union, no matter how nasty the means. And this will lead in 22 years, in July 1969, to the fact that America will make terrestrial mankind believe that the world's greatest deception ever has been perpetrated by America, namely by faking a fictitious landing on the moon and by astronauts treading on the moon's surface, which will be denied by America for all future times with all means of art and modern technology. The reason for this deception will simply be to humiliate the Soviet Union in a threatening manner and to make America appear to be the world's first, best and technically most developed state, which the Soviet Union is supposed to be afraid of because America is militarily much better equipped both offensively and defensively. In this far-reaching deception, not only the present time will be taken into account but also the future, with the space program continuing to operate in a strict and hectic manner, only to fake the failure of an announced moon landing on another moon flight, of which there will be several in all. This breakdown is supposed to be such that due to technical failure the announced landing on the moon cannot be carried out, so that the rocket will only orbit the moon and return to Earth unperformed. However, this will be a further fraud, because in reality, the technology that has been developed since the first fraud will allow and execute a landing on the moon with the exact landing tracks, footprints and lanes of a lunar vehicle. And this will be done in order to create less than proofs greater than that the allegedly less than first greater than moon landing of America has taken place, when with better far-sightedness observation techniques from the Earth, which are still to come, the lunar surface can be searched with centimeter precision. This, as well as the fact that when the moon flights still carried out in the 1970s are finished again and then resumed and continued in the third millennium, it may be possible to see the tracks laid. And when in the new millennium the moon will be approached again, and this then also by China, the new Russia and other countries, then the moon will serve as a launch station for flights to the neighboring planets of the Earth as well as to the wider and deeper region of the solar system. However, this area has nothing to do with world space, even if the solar system area is wrongly called world space. Correctly, world space only begins where the space of the entire solar system ends, whereas only the solar space area exists in it. What can be further predicted is as follows. The great mass of the henceforth rapidly growing terrestrial humanity, which in terms of its growth will overflow with all reason, will inevitably lead to the fact that people will become continuously more unable to live and thus, also from a psychological point of view, constantly more unstable and more frequently fall into depression. This fact will be particularly evident in times of crisis, which will be largely malignant, especially when situations of isolation occur, such as close family or group living together, etc., leading to and sometimes even making numerous domestic violence and even murder and manslaughter the order of the day. In the future, it will also happen that many diseases and ailments that could be alleviated or cured up to now will no longer be alleviable or curable, because certain physical organic germs of suffering and disease will become resistant to individual or all medical remedies. On the one hand, this will result from the excessive use and application of medicines, which will lead to multiple resistance to many germs of suffering and disease and claim many victims. Many ailments and diseases, which in the future will arise very acutely, currently and incurably through many kinds of poisons, which will be applied thoughtlessly, unscrupulously and unscrupulously, as well as a result of profit and profit-seeking in the entire agricultural economy, in agriculture and horticulture, and which will poison the groundwater, drinking water as well as all vegetables, fruits, berries, mushrooms and herbs etc., will in the future be responsible for death, wasting away, suffering and any physical handicap, as well as psychological damage etc. Planet Earth will be hollowed out in the coming time and will soon be like the image of a Swiss Emmental cheese. Besides the fact that the entire surface face of the earth will be destroyed, it will be littered with houses, factories, high-rise cities, quarries, motorways, sports facilities, sun sails and windmills for electricity generation, with deforested, destroyed primeval forests, moors and rainforests as well as with their fields and so on and so forth. Many systems of natural habitats will from now on, as explained once again below, be largely robbed, irrevocably destroyed and annihilated by the greedy needs of the endless and irresponsibly increasing and billions of people on Earth, as well as many life forms of many different species of fauna and flora will be completely exterminated and masses of people will be killed off by suffering, diseases and epidemics. All habitats are being destroyed by the endlessly increasing needs and the resulting or destroying machinations of the rampantly growing humanity on Earth, and also a climate catastrophe is being caused. The future will bring a worldwide atmospheric pollution and atmospheric poisoning by poisonous substances of all kinds, such as vehicle exhaust fumes, huge forest and landscape fires, by heat emissions of all kinds, etc., as well as a global warming and climate destruction, as well as a climate shift on all continents, combined with the melting of the poles and all glaciers and permafrost, which will release dangerous earth methane gases everywhere, as well as in the seabed, because the temperatures of the oceans are rising just as much as those of the climate. But what will happen in the coming decades up to the first years of the new third millennium, before a major change in global warming is so drastically progressing and triggered that worldwide climatic natural disasters will be unstoppable? There would be so much to report that could fill a large book if the individual events had to be listed in sequence, such as that this very year 1947 in November in America a novel technical development product will be completed, which will bring a revolutionary progress in the so-called semiconductor technology and will replace in future the present electron tube system, which, as my friend Sfath explained to me, corresponds to the first active electronic components, which can amplify small electrical signals in a somewhat linear way, and which founded the electronic age, whereby these components were initially used for radio sets. The revolutionary technical innovation to be completed in November will in future replace the obsolete electron tube system by the aforementioned new invention or development, which will be called less than transistor greater than. This is, according to the declaration, a so-called electronic semiconductor component by which low electrical currents and voltages can be controlled. This new less than transistor technology will be used to create a wide variety of new electronic apparatuses and equipment, measuring instruments, tools, as well as instrument, machine, aircraft, vehicle and rocket controls. Further, the consequence will be that the whole electronic remote communication technology will be combined by these less than transistors greater than with time by another electrotechnical invention, and revolutionized by this to another valuable innovation. A further significant event occurs some 15 months later, on Friday the 4th of February 1949. When the Persian Emperor Reza Pahlavi is assassinated in Tehran and injured by several shots, but survives the attempt on his life. In addition to many very unpleasant political, military, inhuman and natural disasters around the world up to 1957, in March 1957 in Rome the negotiators and representatives of Italy, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium and France will negotiate and decide on a merger of European states to form a so-called European Economic Community. This will, however, already include an insidious idea of a secret first laying of the foundation stone, by which, on the way to a common economic policy, the integration of all European states into an already secretly planned dictatorial Europe Union will be the ultimate goal. This will begin in 1959, when miniaturized electronic circuits will be invented, and with them so-called microprocessors, which will be very small, measuring less than 1 square centimeter. Consequently, according to the Information Declaration, these products will be manufactured in large quantities from 1968 onwards using a semiconductor material, and the newly developed circuit will then be integrated into completely new information and communication technology equipment, etc. The whole thing then leads, also after detailed explanations and also looking into the future, to far-reaching wireless telecommunication technology for everyone, whereby in the course of the next decades up to the third millennium everyone will carry a small pocket communication device of about 5x 10x 1 centimeters with them, so to speak, with which they can communicate anywhere in the world. In the future, evil and sinister terrorist machinations, in particularly religiously sectarian terrorism mania and neo-Nazi grouping mania, will arise, as well as new large and widespread religious sects. These will dominate countless people and the world of those who believe in them and in a God, just as they will murder people in their fanaticism, commit mass murders and criminal and violent acts contemptuous of human life and other crimes. This, as it already happened in ancient and other ancient times, and especially in the Middle Ages, when the plague of persecution and murder of witches allegedly linked to a devil was rampant and many innocent people were cruelly tortured, beheaded by sword or burned alive at the stake. And in this respect, equality should be remembered when, in the mid-1960s, countless equally innocent people were burned by America and its army in Vietnam in the same way as in the witch hunt. Real witches had nothing to do with the devil or Beelzebub or with fairies and spirits, but they were usually herbalists who helped people with their knowledge and herbs. The original term witch is described in the mythology of Wikipedia as follows.
Wikipedia 2020. This article deals with a witch. For other meanings of witch or witches, see witches. For the car brand witch, see witch, car brand. In fairy tales, myths and popular belief, a witch is a woman equipped with magical powers who can cast damaging spells. In European culture, since the late Middle Ages, she has been classically seen in connection with demons or the devil in the form of a pact or boot ship, with other criteria also being added. The term is also used as a derogatory term or swear word for a malicious, quarrelsome, unpleasant or ugly female person. In classical antiquity, witches appeared as powerful human women, such as Kirkando, who were said to be able to enchant people and animals with magic and poisons. In the Fasti, Ovid told of tricky, anthropomorphic, witch-like female figures, and Horace invented Canidia, a fictitious witch, but in this story she already uses the well-known term infanticide to brew a love potion. At the time of witch hunting, the term witch or sorcerer was occasionally used as a foreign term to refer to women and men who were being persecuted on charges of sorcery, witchcraft. Later it became generally accepted, especially in the scientific investigation of the phenomenon of witch hunting. For the application of the term to men as sorcerers or warlocks, see also witchcraft.
Many murders and mass murders will also take place around the world in the coming period as a result of a newly spreading sectarian mania, which will continue far into the third millennium and will turn young people in particular into prisoners and slaves of faith, thus making them, as has been the case with all believers since time immemorial, give up their own thinking, reasoning, deciding and acting, and consequently become stupid. And this will have the longer, the more the consequence that these people will henceforth, the longer, the more they will become servile to others, who parrot wordy religious sectarian as well as political phrases until they give up their sense of reality and truth against reason and become believers of religious, sectarian and political lies, slander and seduction, and thus dependent on what they are persuaded to believe. And this will come in a short time, for it will begin in a blatant way as early as the decade of the 1980s, for then everything and anything will change in a radicalizing way in the whole earthly sphere, negatively and destructively, to evil and bad, including the behavior of men towards stupidity, inadequacy, irresponsibility and multiple incapacity. This will also affect those people who, as rulers, would have to lead their peoples, but who will be incapable of doing so and will not know what to do effectively to protect and preserve the health of their peoples when the Great Plague will be rampant in the second decade of the third millennium, claiming millions of lives. Like them, the rulers, innumerable people of all nations will become the serfs of others, through whom they will be misled, influenced and willously directed and exploited according to the ideas, conceptions and wishes of others. And just as countless people in the future will also fall prey to the greed of others and themselves, will no longer be able to control their own desires and will no longer be able to learn anything important for life, so will their ability to live, their stability, their dignity, their joy of life, their fulfillment and their courage to live. All the values which are important in this respect are no longer learned through education and self-education from childhood onwards, because parents are no longer aware of the educational needs and therefore fail in their education. As a result, the descendants will become increasingly unable to live in the coming period, and therefore, on the one hand, when they fall into special situations, become old or are confronted with some kind of problem, they do not know either on or off, because they are deprived of logical thinking. In conclusion, in the coming times, countless people will avoid reality and life and commit suicide, young and old, and even children. Many of them will spend their lives in addiction and misery through alcohol, natural or chemical drugs, etc., only to die of it in a miserable way. Others will recklessly engage in life-threatening sports, only to lose their lives one day as a result of carelessness, inattention or special circumstances. But in the future there will be a great many people of all ages who will kill themselves or have themselves killed as a result of not coping with life, precisely by taking their own life, driven by cowardice, and thus by murdering themselves or having themselves murdered in some way. Prior to all this, Switzerland will be a less than golden place, greater than, or rather a suicide assistance El Dorado for people who want to commit suicide as willing suicides, attracting suicidal people from all over the world like a stinking cheese attracting masses of flies. Also the suicide assistance organizations, which will emerge in the coming time, and which will enrich themselves on the suicidal willing and satisfy their desire to kill, can be compared in the future with the religious sectarian murder and mass murder behavior, which began in early times and has claimed many human victims. And in this respect, some of the evils that will take place in the coming decades should be mentioned, although some of them should be started and serve as an introduction to what already occurred in early India regarding the goddess Kali. To explain this requires a little history, which I might still be able to bring together. Kali, the Black One, is in Hinduism an important goddess of death and destruction, but she also embodies time and nature, but also renewal. In Indian mythology, she is an embodiment of anger, and she is said to have sprung from the forehead of another god and then filled the universe with a terrible roar. In other Indian myths she is the dark side of the deity Parvati and one of the deity Mahavira. In the popular belief of the Hindus, Kali is one of the few goddesses who are also supposed to fulfill wishes. A mythological story tells of a fight with the demon Raktabija, who threatened to throw the world out of balance. Whenever he was injured and lost a limb or a drop of blood that fell to the ground, a second Raktabija is said to have emerged from it, making him invincible. Thus the gods came in distress and turned to the mother goddess Devi, who manifested herself as Kali and attacked the demon, cut off its head and drank all its blood, thus destroying Raktabija. The mythology teaches that Kali is the goddess of complete destruction, but also Mother Earth, to whom everything returns, and that she is always careful that nothing is lost. Well, there is the story that this mythology gave rise to the so-called Kali sect, whose members wore a silk scarf and used it to murder people who were hostile to them or were assassinated on their orders by strangling them with the silk scarf. And as I was told in 1945 by two less than former greater than Kali followers, this murder sect is said to secretly exist until today, as well as everything within the above-mentioned framework is said to still be practiced, for which I was shown as proof a man strangled with a silk scarf, and told that since the emergence of the Kali sect 2,000 years or so ago, more than 2 million people are said to have been murdered in this way. Unfortunately, I could not find out whether the whole thing was simply staged or not. Well, true or not true, in a certain way other murderous facts in other early times are demonstrable, because everywhere religious sectarian murders and massacres occurred in all religions and sects, especially in Christianity, for example by the Crusaders, when they were called to conquer Palestine for the first Christian crusade in 1095 by Pope Urban II, although it was not until the following year that everything began in the name of Christ with armed laymen, declared as a pilgrimage. However, several armies of knights from Italy, France and Germany were involved in conquest, committing enormous inhumane massacres, crimes, rapes and pillaging on their war journey from Europe to Palestine, as well as other shameful acts of violence, as witnessed by witnesses. The crusade ended in 1099 with the capture of Jerusalem by the army of crusaders who mercilessly murdered in the name of Jesus. In the Middle Ages, a sect also achieved dubious fame in Arabia, namely the radical and insidious Shiite Islamic assassin secret society of the Nizarite religious community, alias the Ismailit murderer gang, assassin murderer sect and contract killer sect. Their religiously fanatical aim was to assassinate the leaders of their enemies, but they were not content with that, because murder was often committed only for the sake of lust or profit, as many Christian sects and individual Christian believers have done since the emergence of Christianity as a result of their fanatical delusion of faith. With regard to the confused Christ delusion, the devil delusion, the Christian delusion that people would either be in the service of Satan and engage in sexual practices with him, such as, for example, mainly women who were accused of being witches and were shamefully murdered, also arose early on. Others, again especially women, were and still are accused of being possessed by the devil personally and are abused and even killed for this far into the third millennium. Such an event will happen just when I, as an adult man, will live in Switzerland for a short time in 1966 with my parents in Ringwil. It will then come about that a Christian sect will settle in this place and carry out exorcisms and beat a 17-year-old girl to death.
Wikipedia. Today is the 50th anniversary of the murder of Ptaah That. The 17-year-old had been beaten to death in an exorcism by 6 members of the sect. 22 years later, the main perpetrator killed again. It is 1966, when the tranquil Ringwil was startled by horrible news. In a small, somewhat remote chalet above the Hinwil hamlet, 17-year-old Ptaah That was violently killed in the night of the 14th to 15th of May. The body showed severe injuries to various parts of the body, including the buttocks and genitals, which must have been caused by blunt instruments, reported the Zürcher Oberländer 5 days after the crime. At a press conference in Zurich, the cantonal police, among others, had previously given details of the circumstances of death and the perpetrators who had already been arrested. And because of the nationality of the 2 main perpetrators, editors of German newspapers and magazines, such as the Spiegel and Die Zeit, soon reported about the small Ringwil. Thus, the public learned that Ptaah That had died after an exorcism of an apocalyptic sect that had been growing in the shadow of Catholicism, beaten to death by 5 adult men and 1 woman. The sect called itself International Family Community for the Promotion of Peace and was founded in German singing by the excommunicated Father Joseph Stocker, the Holy Father, and his assistant Magdalena Gola, the Holy Mother. It was also Stocker and Gola who sealed the death of Ptaah That on that fatal night. Clothes washed by yourself. Because they were wanted in Germany for fraud, 59-year-old Stocker and 52-year-old Gola had fled to Switzerland. The sect leaders set up their new meeting place in the chalet in Ringwil, which served primarily as a holiday home for a bar mitzvah family from Wangen near Olten and a greengrocer from Ruti. The 17-year-old Ptaah That, whose parents lived in Helikon in Haag and who had fallen victim to the sect, lived in Germany for about 4 years in a home for children, which the sect still ran there. On the 22nd of July 1966, Die Zeit wrote that girls had been brought from Germany to Ringwil several times if they had not done their homework. And so it happened to Ptaah That. Because she allegedly caused educational difficulties and had made lewd speeches, the 3 brothers of the Bar Mitzvah family, the businessman from Rutten and the two cult leaders beat Ptaah Dat for an hour on that May night with walking sticks, a plastic pipe and a riding whip. They beat the girl until her subcutaneous fat tissue was shattered and did not stop torturing her afterwards, after she had been pushed into the bathtub by the accused Magdalena Koller, the Holy Mother, in her precarious condition, and was showered off because of her clothes smeared with excrement. Ptaah Dat had to wash out her clothes on her instructions in the brook passing in front of the chalet, for which the accused Hans Barmettler tortured her, writes Walter Matthias de Gelman in his book Accent Prosis, Die Teufelse Strafe von Ringwil. The writer from Montchaltorf, who died in 1979, had written the book in 1969 about the crime, the course of the trial, the life and the psychological development of the accused. When the adults looked after the girl in the morning, she was dead from a fat embolism of the lungs, which had occurred as a result of the shattering of her tissue. The world spoke about Ringwil. Nobody in Ringwil noticed the tortures Ptaah Dat suffered that night. The inhabitants only learned about it from the newspaper. It was a shock for all of us, says a Ringler who does not want to read his name in the paper. We fell out of all the clouds. We didn't even know that the members of a sect were coming and going in the chalet, he says. Ringler Peter Schmidt also remembers the time well. It was a big thing. We were all very affected at the beginning. We couldn't believe that something like that could happen in our farming village, says the long-standing member of the Reformed Church Ringwil. Soon, not only domestic newspapers, but also foreign newspapers filled up with articles about the deed. Suddenly the whole world was talking about Ringwil. I was 23 years old, and a few weeks after the crime I went on holiday with my colleagues to the south of France. One of them was very ashamed on the trip to say that we came from Ringwil, says Schmidt. And the other Ringler also remembers, during the WW, the other recruits approached me about the case, he says. The fact that no one from the village itself was involved in the crime helped the inhabitants of the hamlet to close the case in all those years. Nobody really knew the people from the cottage settlement up there. The houses were remote, and the inhabitants did not associate with us, says Schmidt. We didn't know the girl, and 5 of the 6 perpetrators were strangers. Even the greengrocer who took part in the exorcism was not a local as Rutner. He was not one of us. Schmidt remembers well, however, that people no longer bought from him. His name was known to all. The hatred for him was great, says the other Ringler. So big that the businessman's chalet was set on fire twice in a row after the crime. While there was little damage to the chalet the first time, the second time it burned like crazy, recalls the former constable of the Ringwil Fire Brigade, who himself was involved in the firefighting operations at the time. The hatred was apparently so great that his family members are no longer associated with the events and do not wish to comment on them. God knows that they have suffered enough in the past, they said. While the businessman's family struggled with the situation for a very long time, the Ringler family itself eventually closed the case. It would therefore be wrong to say that the deed changed the hamlet forever. We were stunned, but at some point it was over, says Schmidt. Neither shame nor regret. In January and February 1969, the trial of the perpetrators took place in the Strafgerichtssaal in Zurich. The newspapers wrote about the last witch trial, where the Teufel von Ringwil, so die it, explained their deed to the jury. They all said that they did not want to meet the girl, but only Satan. The sinful girl did not react to the beating with crying or screaming, because she did not feel the beating, because the beating hit the devil, said writer de Gelman Magdalena Koller to the jury. While Koller showed neither remorse nor shame, nor did he admit guilt, Joseph Stocker promised for all 17 defendants, I consider my behavior today as a mistake that I will never make again. I will make sure that there will never be another beating in my surroundings. Kohler and Stocker were each sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, 15 years expulsion from the country and loss of civil rights to 5 years, the businessman from Rutan to a prison sentence of 4 and the Barmettler brothers to 3 years each. The drama repeats itself. The 10 years in prison did not change Magdalena Kohler. After her release, she continued where she had left off. At the end of October 1988 she was on trial again, this time in Constance. After serving her sentence, she was expelled from Switzerland and then returned to St. John, where she was still venerated as a holy mother by sect members, including the elderly Anna Wormer-Tozer. For almost 5 years Magdalena Kohler, who was now 73 years old, together with her sister Hildegard Rolle, tormented the pensioner Wormer-Tozer in the context of expelling the devil, as the Spiegel wrote in October 1988. For years the sisters kicked Wormerhouses with their knees and hit them with the flat of their hands and a carpet beater. So the drama was practically repeated in singing.
Much will continue to happen in the future in the same context as it will happen in Guyana. For example, from today in 31 years' time, 1978, where a sect leader in a settlement orders his devastated believers to commit mass suicide and, through assassins, mass murder will be committed, whereby almost 1,000 believing sect members will die as a result of their delusional belief in a Christian God and a Christian Savior. But even this will only be a small episode of the fatal degeneration of all religious sectarian beliefs, which will spread more and more worldwide in just a few decades. Also in 1994 a radically world-rejecting, internationally active solar secret society in Switzerland will make a name for itself through collective suicide, with around 50 people falling victim to the sectarian delusion. This, along with other identical or similar incidents that will occur from today until then all over the world, and also after the above-mentioned occurrence from 1994 until well into the future of the third millennium. What further needs to be said refers to the fact that from now on through the enormous growth of Earth, mankind like never before Earth-encompassing catastrophes will shake the world, such as rampant misery, hardship, wars and famines beyond compare. In the future, rampant epidemics will arise worldwide, as will be the case with various types of epidemics from Africa and Asia in the coming decades. In the decade of the new millennium, a man-made epidemic will not only claim hundreds of thousands of people, but will claim lives beyond the 1 million mark. Thousands of deaths will be claimed as early as the beginning of the new millennium, when reckless refugee migrations from Africa, the Orient and Asia are triggered through the guilt of an irresponsible, autocratic and stupid German ruler, and tens of thousands of deaths result from these waves of refugees. Thousands of dead will drown in the Mediterranean Sea, many will be driven off, sink and no longer be found. And this will be at that time when a religious fanatic in Turkey has risen up as a president dictator through fraud and suspends the freedom and order created by the Turkish founder Kemal Atatürk and enforces new sect regulations. Before the end of this century, a fanatical religious sectarian terrorism originating from Islam emerges in the Orient, which has already been mentioned, called the less than Islamic state greater than, and worldwide death, horror, calamity and destruction well into the third millennium and in malicious forms, and will bring completely degenerate ways. A few things should be explained in addition: how that in the new millennium this terrorist organization will spread rapidly around the world and remain active for a very long time as a global and completely fanatical, extreme religious sectarian terror radicalism with countless assassinations, threats and murders. torture, misery, death, crime, destruction, hardship, endangering life, murders and suicide bombings, threats, bomb attacks, rape and a variety of calamities will remain the terror beast of the less than Islamic State greater than for decades into the new millennium. As already mentioned, everything that is essential will spread all over the world, but especially in the whole of Europe and in the countries of the still-to-be-established Union dictatorship. This dictatorship will gradually rise and spread over all its members of the Union, whereby only gradually the individual dictatorship member countries will recognize the real evil and will timidly defend themselves. Everything that comes from now on will be shared with all countries of the world, including the world itself. Bring enormous disadvantages to the entire planet, nature and its fauna and flora, the entire natural system, the atmosphere and especially the already slowly warming climate. In the future, especially from the beginning of the third millennium, more and more and completely degenerate natural disasters will occur more and more frequently and offer mankind a bad future that they can no longer control. The entire earthly view of the world, the characters of Earth people, their mentalities and thus also their behavior, their sense of responsibility as well as their personalities and their viability and longevity will change into evil, dissatisfied, neglected, unpeaceful, indifferent, greedy and malicious. Switzerland will not be spared either, because due to the naivety of the government and security services etc. as well as the know-it-alls, the threat of terrorism in the country will not be recognized. This, as well as the religiously believing false humanists in the third millennium will contribute a great deal to the emerging disaster in all of Europe, because out of their false religious humanity they will open doors and gates for hundreds and thousands of degenerate terrorists of both sexes around this one to give less than safe haven greater than which will then be rewarded with calamity, murder, violence and crime. Many religious maniacs of the growing terrorist organization will secretly sneak into many countries, or pretend to be refugees, or openly enter Europe as visitors or immigrants and spread mischief, death and destruction. Switzerland will not be spared from such immigrants, just as it will not be spared, as will be the case in all dictatorship countries of Europe, that even the country's own citizens convert to Islam as a result of a change of denomination or out of a thirst for adventure or murder. However, along with other countries on Earth, Europe in particular will be severely affected by this, for which the stupid ruler of Germany and all these supporters are responsible. However then, as usual, will not be held accountable. In particular, however, many Europeans themselves will also be involved, mainly young people and adults who are unrealistic, who turn to and join the terrorist organization and its faith, which will emerge from Islam in a completely abnormal way. In the coming decades, the unreasonableness of people will lead to an enormous mass of earthly humanity emerging, and this will reach 10 billion in the next millennium by the middle of the first century. In the coming decades, a very large excess of people will be born very quickly and the earth will be criminally overpopulated, according to the biblical lie, which according to a non-existent less than dear God greater than should have said less than go and multiply greater than. A lie, through people fall into a sick delusion and believe this nonsense, trust it in stupidity and are blind to reality and truth. In the future, too, they will follow the lies preached and, in return, make terror, murder, kill and torture. The believers, afflicted by a religious and sectarian delusion of lies, blindly follow their false and murderous religious teachings and bring their religious disaster over the whole world. As always, Believers follow religions and sects because they do not think and are stupid, and they will continue to do so in the future and follow all evil religious and sectarian lies. As in the past, believers will continue to listen to completely insane and unscrupulous sectarian do-gooders, conspirators and religious terrorist fanatics, build up the terrorist armies and destruction squads, whose members and followers become unscrupulous murder machines as organized murder squads, splinter groups or fanatical individual perpetrators kill innocent people and cause destruction. And this will be the future of Earth mankind, because calamity, murder and destruction, drug addiction, crimes and human degeneration of all kinds will be uncheckedly spread on Earth in a targeted or indiscriminate manner, because in 40 years the great chaos will begin across the Earth. Epoch that will gain anarchist traits in the third millennium and will open doors and gates to lawlessness, because the people on Earth lose their knowledge of honor and dignity. They lose their level-headedness and their judgment as well as their sense of correct decisions, because as a result of their loss of reason they also lose their ability to think and focus their desires only on various addictions, such as drugs of all kinds, festivities, pleasure, money, travel, football, sport and disharmonious riot, which will be called music, etc. With the enormously growing excess of humanity, the planet, all natural systems, fauna and flora and also the climate are largely destroyed and driven to the brink of threatening total annihilation. The Earth will be overpopulated in a short time, and in the future it will quickly drive the destruction of nature, fauna, flora and climate forward. By conceiving and giving birth to innumerable new offspring, the excess of humanity drives up all disaster that will henceforth rule the Earth and humanity. And this results from the machinations of the overflowing human race as a result of their needs, which must be met by exploiting the planet and nature, their fauna and flora and all their systems, with the climate also being impaired, and by all the activities endlessly everything will be largely destroyed, in particular by anthropogenic heat emissions that are produced and which will drive the climate almost into collapse. And this is what Earth mankind will do in the future, namely because they lose their logical thinking as a result of excessive breeding, thereby falling into stupidity and thus possibly bargaining death. According to detailed instructions, anthropogenic heat emissions are toxic gases released by humans, along with other unnatural emissions that spread in the atmosphere and are the most important cause of the warming impairment of the climate, which results in climate change. For centuries, the instruction says, anthropogenic risk. Emissions effects caused by humans that negatively affect the atmosphere and the climate, such as large-scale fires of all kinds, cooking and heating with materials that produce very poisonous gases, etc. The modern era, which, according to teachings, began in 1844, and with it also an enormous and rapid development of technology, means that heat emissions have been increasing since then, and that ever faster and more extensively increasing in relation to the growing Earth population. 19. The ever greater and ever more rapid increase in anthropogenic heat emissions, which are mainly composed of carbon dioxide. Note Billy, 2020 equals CO2. Carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide corresponds to a chemical compound of carbon and oxygen and forms an incombustible, acidic, colorless and poisonous one gas. And oxygen exist, will not only bring the climate tremendously upset, but transform it in this way or change and bring about a change that will bring destruction, annihilation and also natural extermination of various genera and species of fauna and flora on Earth with it. Before anything else, however, the Earth's atmosphere will first and foremost be affected by billions of tons of exhaust gases from countless heating systems that run on wood, coal and later on oil and petroleum, etc. However, countless work machines and vehicles, planes, small to giant ships and all kinds of sports vehicles will from now on contribute to the pollution of the air and damage to the climate, which will bring fatal calamity and endless destruction, both for mankind itself as well as for all nature, its fauna, flora and all natural systems in general. With climate change, like this one, through the fault of Earth, mankind as a result of their excess mass, which runs into many billions, and their damaging and all destructive and completely degenerating manipulations on the planet and all its natural systems, will be called trivializing. Already today, starting in 1947, a zone-by-zone cooling or warming, which will drag on over different periods of time. Even this abnormally hot summer this year, since here in Nidaflax/Bulak the thermometer, along with two others in different places, are currently reading 46.8 degrees directly on the sun, is a harbinger of the coming rapid climate changes on Earth, all four of which climate zones of the planet are affected. So in the course of the coming times until well into the future of the third and fourth millennia, the changes and conditions that border on the primeval world will take place in every climate. Arctic climate zone, cold zone. Moderate climate zone, middle zone. Equatorial climatic zone, belt zone. Antarctic climatic zone, cold zone. The coming anthropogenic crisp. Climatic destruction caused by terrestrial mankind through unscrupulous and irresponsible manipulation of the planet, nature, its fauna and flora as well as all natural systems has effects on all regions of the world. The ice of the polar caps, respectively. The Arctic and Antarctic will melt just as rapidly, making the streams and rivers, together with storms of rain, raging, destructive and deadly currents, just as the lakes and sea levels will rise and tear much inhabited and fertile land into the wild and raging waters. Extreme weather events and increasing rainfall will occur more and more frequently in different regions, while elsewhere intensifying cold spells with very low temperatures will be just as destructive and fatal as in other areas extreme droughts caused by enormous hot spurts. And all these events that arise through human guilt as a result of their excessive population and will occur in the future will no longer be able to be stopped, because no one will listen to the warnings and predictions. Consequently, all of the disasters announced in advance will take their course and many deaths, destruction, annihilations and exterminations as well as all kinds of hardship, will bring suffering, great sadness and misery of all kinds. Eduard Meyer, Nidaflax 1253, May the 16th, 1947.
Wikipedia 2020. Carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide is a chemical compound of carbon and oxygen with the empirical formula CO2, an incombustible, acidic and colorless gas. It dissolves well in water. Colloquially it is often incorrectly called carbonic acid, especially in connection with beverages containing carbon dioxide. With basic metal oxides or hydroxides, it forms two types of salts called carbonates and hydrogen carbonates. CO2 is an important part of the global carbon cycle and, as a natural component of the air, an important greenhouse gas in the Earth's atmosphere. Human activities, above all the burning of fossil fuels, increased the proportion in the Earth's atmosphere from approx. 280 parts per million ppm, parts per million at the beginning of industrialization to 407, 8 ppm in 2018. In May 2019, a monthly average of around 415 ppm was measured at the NOAA Mauna Loa monitoring station in Hawaii. The trend continues to rise. This increase causes an intensification of the greenhouse effect, which in turn is the cause of the current global warming. Around 100 million tons of carbon dioxide are released into the atmosphere every day through human activities as of 2020. With an adequate supply of oxygen, CO2 is created both during the combustion of carbonaceous substances and in the organism of living things as a product of cellular respiration. Plants, algae as well as some bacteria and archaea convert CO2 through fixation, carbon dioxide assimilation, into biomass. During photosynthesis, glucose is created from inorganic CO2 and water. CO2 can be toxic. However, the concentrations and amounts in the air or through the consumption of lemonade, for example, are far from sufficient for this. It has a wide range of technical applications. In the chemical industries, it is used to extract urea. In solid form as dry ice, it is used as a coolant. Supercritical carbon dioxide serves as a solvent and extractant. The human-made, anthropogenic, greenhouse effect is due to the rapid increase in emissions of carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, nitrous oxide, N2O, and other synthetic gases that are concentrated in the atmosphere. These long-wave rays heat the Earth and cause the mean temperature to be around 18 degrees Celsius. This process can be compared to the warming of a glass house, which earned it the name of the greenhouse effect. Gas molecules with more than 2 atoms such as carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, etc. absorb infrared radiation and in this way store heat in the Earth's atmosphere. The resulting warming of the atmosphere is known as the greenhouse effect, and the trace gases that cause it as greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are gaseous components of the atmosphere that cause the so-called greenhouse effect. In doing so, they absorb long-wave radiation, thermal radiation, that is radiated from the Earth's surface, the clouds and the atmosphere itself. December 6, 2019. Greenhouse gases are gases in the atmosphere that can absorb heat radiation from the Earth and radiate back to the Earth. The greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, CO2. It is produced with every combustion, regardless of whether wood, coal, gas, petrol, heating oil or diesel fuel is burned. The resulting warming of the atmosphere is known as the greenhouse effect, and the trace gases that cause it as greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are gaseous components of the atmosphere that cause the so-called greenhouse effect. In doing so, they absorb long-wave radiation, thermal radiation, that is radiated from the Earth's surface, the clouds and the atmosphere itself. December 6, 2019. Greenhouse gases are gases in the atmosphere that can absorb heat radiation from the Earth and radiate back to the Earth. The greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, CO2. It is produced with every combustion, regardless of whether wood, coal, gas, petrol, heating oil or diesel fuel is burned. The resulting warming of the atmosphere is known as the greenhouse effect, and the trace gases that cause it as greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are gaseous components of the atmosphere that cause the so-called greenhouse effect. In doing so, they absorb long-wave radiation, thermal radiation, that is radiated from the Earth's surface, the clouds and the atmosphere itself. December 6, 2019. Greenhouse gases are gases in the atmosphere that can absorb heat radiation from the Earth and radiate back to the Earth. The greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, CO2. It is produced with every combustion, regardless of whether wood, coal, gas, petrol, heating oil or diesel fuel is burned, which cause the so-called greenhouse effect. In doing so, they absorb long-wave radiation, thermal radiation, that is radiated from the Earth's surface, the clouds and the atmosphere itself. December the 6th, 2019. Greenhouse gases are gases in the atmosphere that can absorb heat radiation from the Earth and radiate back to the Earth. The greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, CO2. It is produced with every combustion, regardless of whether wood, coal, gas, petrol, heating oil or diesel fuel is burned, which cause the so-called greenhouse effect. In doing so, they absorb long-wave radiation, thermal radiation, that is radiated from the Earth's surface, the clouds and the atmosphere itself. December the 6th, 2019. Greenhouse gases are gases in the atmosphere that can absorb heat radiation from the Earth and radiate back to the Earth. The greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, CO2. It is produced with every combustion, regardless of whether wood, coal, gas, petrol, heating oil or diesel fuel is burned.
Thank you. I was really crazy back then, but I don't remember everything.
There is also an appendix to the whole thing, but for understandable reasons you had to remain silent about it.
Yes, there really needs to be silence about that, today and tomorrow, which is why you shouldn't bring these things up either.
I don't understand that the ascetic talked to you about it, because she too is obliged to be silent to everyone, so she shouldn't have said anything to you either.
You are right, but it just happened that way, because I just happened without her knowledge. Well, it just happened without her being responsible, because
As you have just heard, I am called and have to go. What you explain, however, I didn't know. You never mentioned anything about it either.
Right, because on the one hand there was the silence, on the other hand, well, what else should we talk about? Besides, you have to go, and so I wish you goodbye, dear friend.
Yes, I really have to go. Goodbye.